the way that our capitalist system set up is that it has produced these exceptional billionaires that have a tremendous amount of power. I mean, if you look at what we call the Magnificent Seven stocks, this is your Amazon, Nvidia, Google, Facebook, Tesla, your Microsoft, your biggest seven companies, that makes up around 40% of the stock market. So you think about the entire U.S. stock market is made up of about 40% is around these seven stocks. And as you look at these CEOs, every one of them is hundreds of billions of dollars of net worth. And interesting enough, most of them were on stage with President Trump, during the inauguration. Unfortunately, especially in the United States, in our political system, it is a pay-for-play system. You have to have a tremendous amount of money to be successful in American politics. Do I see this being addressed? No, unfortunately, I see the gap only getting bigger.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking to Cyrus Janssen, an international business consultant, entrepreneur, and fellow YouTube analyst with a very large channel, nearing 1 million subscribers. With over 10 years of experience doing business in China, Cyrus often posts short-form analysis as well as longer interviews, often focusing on China and BRICS developments. This is what I want to discuss with him today to get his take on where world geopolitics is headed. So, Cyrus, welcome.
Thank you so much, Pascal. Been a big fan of the channel and very honored to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for taking the time. I mean, you have this special position that you spend a lot of time in China and you experienced firsthand China over the last 15 years or so. I think I saw that you first went there in 2007. And
Correct.
You took a contrarian view early on, also on what was happening in Hong Kong during the protests in 2019, and maybe just give us a little bit of more of your background of how it comes that you see China today in a more positive light than it is often portrayed in the West.
Yeah, no problem. So yeah, like you said, I first went to China in 2007 and I started my career there. So this was just right after university. I graduated university 2 weeks later, bought a one-way ticket to Shanghai, and that's where I started my career. And 2007 was a very pivotal time for China. This was really when China was starting to open up and really become this superpower that we now see today. For 2007, the GDP grew 14.4%. So I mean, the economy was roaring. Of course, Beijing hosted the Olympics in 2008. In Shanghai, we had the 2010 World Expo. So there was a really golden period of time that you really saw the Chinese economy growing very fast. And of course, this was during the economic recession in the West, right? 2008 great financial crisis started by the mortgage crisis in the USA. And so you started to see this very big shift, where there was a lot of companies coming to China. For example, I was working with the American Chamber of Commerce. We had, hundreds and hundreds of American companies coming to China doing big business deals. I mean, it was at that time, it was an amazing time to be in China, especially as an American, because it was a really golden opportunity, to make a lot of money, to basically do a lot of business and to foster this great relationship of the United States and China working together. Of course, I think, what's very sad about this is that as time continued to go on, China started to get bigger and bigger, and there was started to see a noticeable shift in this relationship between the United States and China. And I think, unfortunately, I think the United States became a little bit too intimidated by China, by the rise of China. If you go back to the early days, with, George Bush, and then also Barack Obama, the message was very much, we don't fear a rising China, because if your economy is doing well, you can buy more American products, right? We can make money selling products to you. There's no problem. And then that attitude shifted to, well, we don't want you to grow too much because you're growing a little bit too fast now, and we want you to make sure that you're a distant second place from the United States, who should always be the world hegemony, and we should always be number one. So there's very much this American protectionist mindset, very much this American exceptionalism that, we should be the best and that we are the best. And so this really started to change a lot of things. And of course, China has evolved a lot. And so, I mean, we've seen, how China has changed. And I think, unfortunately, our media in the West has really portrayed China in a certain light that is often very different from what people actually experience. And so, of course, the COVID 2020 was a very difficult time for the entire world. This is really, I would say, the height of that, where a lot of people, began to, look at China, this is China's fault, that we had COVID. And, and then, of course, China closed their borders for the better part of 4 years. So it was a very difficult time for Westerners to start to get an understanding of China. And that was not a good time for China as well, because if you look back at China's history, when China was closed off to the world, that's when it was actually its poorest. It needs, I think a healthy economy needs to have trade. It needs to have communication. It needs to have international visitors. So now we fast forward to 2025. And I think that we're seeing a revival of this. International tourism is growing very fast to China. Many Westerners are now discovering China by social media, by understanding, what really life is like in China. And so I just always want to say that I never want anybody to be influenced by the media. I always want you to, if you've never been to Europe or to South America or to Asia or China, wherever it is, go and experience it for yourself. I think that's always my message. And, there's always a lot more than what the media is going to tell you.
Oh, yes. And funnily enough, there are always certain themes that the media, or at least mainstream media, kind of tries to serve. And the current one is that China is that kind of threatening menace on the other side of the Pacific. But the idea that China is a problem didn't start yesterday, right? I mean,
Right.
Obama declared in 2016 the great pivot to Asia, and I remember, this narrative of China threat. That thing is
Right.
15, 20 years old as well, at least.
Yeah. Yes.
Um,
Yes.
and if we look at the discourse right now, what we find is that even people I admire very much, like John Mearsheimer and others, they say like, look, letting China into the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and letting it become a rich country was probably a bad decision of the United States. And I always ask myself, how come that people frame China's rise as a function of U.S. foreign policy?
Right.
Tell me a little bit about your experience. I mean, the fact that China is good at business and is so pivotal today for the world economy. Where did that come
Yeah.
from in your analysis?
Well, I think it's really interesting, Pascal, is if you actually go back as all the way back to Chairman Mao, so Mao Zedong. I mean, Mao Zedong actually was very, very adamant on actually building a better relationship with the United States. So, we go back 50, 60 years ago in China. And again, at this point, China is one of the top 10 poorest countries in the world. So this is quite an amazing period of time when we go back to this era. But even Mao Zedong, he was very adamant on opening China up and actually building some relationship. And he said, if we can work with the United States, we need the United States to come in here. We need them to invest, and we believe there's a lot of potential, in China, but it will be to open up. Unfortunately for Chairman Mao is that the United States government never wanted to talk to him because he was the communist, and they just said, there's no way we can have any dialogue with you because you are the enemy. And you have to remember, if you go back to this history, Chiang Kai-shek from who went over to Taiwan, he was funded tremendously by the United States government. I mean, the U.S. government poured in hundreds of millions of dollars backing Chiang Kai-shek, and there was actually a huge loss of face for the United States government, because at that time there was, they actually thought that Chiang Kai-shek had more power in mainland China. And so they said, if we can really, back Chiang Kai-shek, we can give him hundreds of millions, he's going to be able to lead a revolution and establish China as a democracy. And the United States will then be able to exert our power and will be able to exert control over that region. But of course, Chiang Kai-shek was really nothing more than just a mercenary in many ways. I mean, he was just all about the money. There was a nickname that they called him, Chang Cash My Check, instead of Chiang Kai-shek, because he really just had made so much money off of the U.S. government. But unfortunately, he had no power there. And so the, very, very foolishly, the United States did not respect Chairman Mao. They did not realize that he had the people's, it really was the people's support. And then, of course, was able to establish the China that we know of to now in 1949, establishing, the People's Republic of China. But I think, as we, that I wanted to go kind of lay that foundation down because, again, it has always been China wanting to open up. Of course, then we saw that with Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s, who really said, look, now we're going to really open up China and we're going to embrace these capitalistic measures. Deng Xiaoping came to the United States, wore the cowboy hat, started going around touring different facilities, and this was again, 1980s. Still, China is not a rich nation at all, and it has this opportunity to grow. And I think that it really is, I would say, a combination of both. I mean, I do think that the United States was very beneficial to China in their rise because it's about doing business. But we always have to remember is that it's American CEOs and American companies who are going to China and building factories and building companies and working with the Chinese people. So, it strikes it as a very interesting conversation when I hear Americans today like, we don't need China. We don't need to manufacture anything in China. Like, we should have zero trade with China. Where I'm like, hey, have you paid attention to the last 40 years? It's our American companies that go to China, right? It's our American companies that are wanting to expand in there. And I would say, for example, let's take Apple, one of the most successful companies in history. It's been an incredible company if you've been an investor in Apple, over the last 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, whatever period of time that is. But I would argue that Apple is much more of a China stock. Apple today would not be anywhere where it is without China. The same could be said for Starbucks, who had for many, many years a tremendous amount of growth and revenue being driven from China. And you can really go through a lot of companies like that when you start looking at these American companies and how much revenue is being driven from China or how much of their products are actually built and made in China. There's been a great benefit to America as well. So I always find this an interesting argument, and I think that we've seen a win-win situation with China entering the WTO. I think we've seen a win-win situation with American companies building companies in or building factories in China and doing business in China. I think it's been a win-win, in my opinion.
I view it like that too, because at the end of the day, we are talking, as you say, we are talking about trade, which always implies like reciprocity on both sides, right? Traders don't
Correct.
trade if they don't believe that there's something in it for them as well.
Correct.
The question is a bit like when there have always been accusations leveled against China, right? First that they steal intellectual property rights, then that they underpay their workers, and therefore it's not a level playing field. All while, of course, in the United States still was, and in certain measures still is, the largest economy in the world. And this narrative that the United States is suffering from unfair trade, and we get that, of course, on steroids at the moment
Right.
by Donald Trump, who,
Correct.
while still the U.S. is on nominally the largest economy in the world, not per capita, not on PPP, but nominally. And how is it that this narrative that the U.S. is suffering because others are trading unfairly is so popular inside the U.S.?
Well, I think unfortunately right now, I'm going to talk specifically right now, the last, 5 years or so, or I guess you could go back to 2016 when Donald Trump first became president. This really marked a very pivotal change in the United States. And the reason for this, Pascal, is in the US, I think Donald Trump really brought in an entire new element to politics, to domestic politics. Donald Trump is the first president to be elected that has no political experience. We all know this about Donald Trump. We know that he speaks off the cuff. He had no filter. He speaks like an average man, just a very passionate man. He's very passionate about America, but he has no filter. And I think with Donald Trump, there's so many things that he will say that doesn't fact check, it doesn't make sense, but it's really kind of what he's feeling at the moment. But the reason why he's been very popular in America is because he simplifies it. Quite simply, the vast majority of Americans don't understand politics. They don't understand economics. But majority of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. So when you have someone speaking to you in such a simple way, like, let's make America great again. Let's reduce your taxes. Let's build more American jobs. When you just have these kind of catchphrases, that really resonates with a large part of the population. And that's why he's become so popular. Now, is he able to do that? Is he able to actually make America great again? I have my doubts. And I mean, we've seen this. We've seen this especially in 2025. The United States reputation on the global stage has declined significantly this year. The tariffs, I mean, as you can imagine, someone that does business between the US and China and have been doing for the last 18 years, I'm very much against the tariffs. I don't think that it's a benefit to the United States. I don't think that it's a benefit to the world. It's certainly not to tariff every single country in the world in the way that he did on April 2nd. And again, here we are in August 2025, and we're going for round two of this Liberation Day, where we're going to be again penalizing many of our closest allies, with actual tariffs and trade barriers. So I think that what's very telling here is JD Vance. JD Vance gave a speech earlier this year where he said, globalization has been a failure. And here's why. In our perfect world, we wanted to have these smaller, underdeveloped countries. Basically, they needed to, we wanted to basically keep them poor. We can basically shift some factories to them. We can allow them to build factories and essentially slowly climb. But there needs to be a gap, right? The United States should be at the top. These developing countries should be below us. It is a very typical American arrogance, this American exceptionalism, and so I found that quite a profound statement from J.D. Vance, because in his mind, his message was, you need to stay poor. You just need to manufacture our stuff. And
Did
by
he say it in
manufacturing
those
our stuff,
terms? Did he say it like that?
he did it. I'm paraphrasing. I'm not direct quoting,
Mm.
but it was essentially, his message was globalization has been a failure because these other countries, what he said is, they didn't just manufacture, they started to invent their own technology.
Mm.
And that's exactly what you've seen with China. And I think that's where his main thing was, is, he was happy for, for China to be the manufacturer, but then all of a sudden China starts innovating, and now they're controlling the needle. So if you go back to, the solar panel industry would be a fantastic industry to examine. If you go back as recent as 2008, actually in Michigan, the state of Michigan in the United States, they had tremendous factories there, and they controlled about 50% of the world's solar at that time. I mean, it was actually phenomenal, at that amount. Japan had maybe about 2%. I think Germany had about maybe 3%, but it was mainly the United States, and China was nowhere to be seen. But what happened is obviously China started manufacturing, they started to developing the technology, and we've seen a tremendous shift. I think Japan has now completely closed down their solar. They're not manufacturing anything. Germany would be less than 1%. USA, very, very minimum as well. But obviously, like, China's 98% now. So they've been able to not only manufacture it better, but they've been able to advance that much, much better, and improve the quality, and got it to a point where, now China's the leader in that. So I think that's a really clear example of, where China is able to, obviously become a manufacturer, but then transition to an innovator and start innovating. And we've seen this with many industries. We've seen that with electrical vehicles, for example. We know the future of EVs is in China. They dominate that industry, the electrical batteries, renewable energy, whether it's wind or turbine, and even, for example, microchips. China is not as advanced, obviously. Taiwan and, the United States, and, semiconductors is a very, very technical process, right? There's not one country in the world that can actually manufacture their own semiconductors. There's a collaborative effort needed. I'm sure you and our guests are aware, like ASML, the Dutch company, they're the only company in the world that produces that high-end lithography machine. So, whether you are, in Taiwan, or you're in Japan or Korea or the United States, you need to have that ASML machine from the Netherlands. So
I thought
again, it's a
Japan also
collaborative
has
effort.
one. Doesn't Japan also
I,
produce lithography machines?
I don't know if it's at the same level. I think ASML is the highest one at that one particular machine. But I think I know that there's not one country that can do it by themselves. I know that it's usually a collaborative effort at some level. And so I think what you're looking at is, but you're looking at China. China is advancing very fast, and I think there's a fascinating thing where we saw an actual pivot from the Donald Trump administration just a couple weeks ago, where, for example, for a long time he wanted to ban NVIDIA from selling their advanced microchips to China, and then they basically pivoted and said, well, we realized that by banning them, we're basically incentivizing them to innovate. So we are now going to allow NVIDIA to begin selling again the H20 chips to China, because we don't want to, give that entire market over to China. That market is a $15 billion industry. So, for Nvidia, which is America's largest company, actually the largest company in the world now, $4 trillion market cap. But for Nvidia, Jensen Huang, he was very happy because, he's been very frequently going to Beijing saying, look, we want to sell you our chips. And I think for Jensen, he said, look, as the world is advancing in AI, I think it's great. China should advance, America should advance. Hopefully they can all advance with NVIDIA chips. So again, you have Jensen Huang, American businessman. I believe he was born in Taiwan. He's Taiwanese background, but U.S. citizen, CEO of the biggest tech company in the world, advocating for, more trade and a better relationship between the U.S. and China.
No, I mean, the business community is usually all for better international relations in order to open markets and keep
Yeah.
supply chains going. So there's no question that U.S. business and Chinese business of obviously would like to cooperate. The question then
Right.
is like, how far does the political system then allow this to happen? And at what terms? But maybe let me ask you about these trade restrictions that Mr. Trump is trying to bring up and what we've also learned through them, right? I mean, this whole
Yeah.
it's really fascinating right now that the US is using tariffs, which, the classical way of using tariffs is to say we are going to grow strategic industries or very important because of political constituencies, we need to protect certain markets because we need to make sure that
Right.
domestically our farmers don't lose out because otherwise we're going to lose power, blah,
Right.
blah, blah, right? So you use it as an instrument that is very detailed in very specific sectors. Mr. Trump has started to use those as basically a form of sanctions light. It's like, okay, we're going to
Yes.
punish your export industry with our market dominance, and this seems to be working with Europe, Japan, and a couple of smaller countries out in Southeast Asia. But it's not working with China. And India and Brazil are also saying, like, we're not taking this stuff anymore. And these are kind of the BRICS states. And
Right.
China even doubled down and said, like, oh, really? You want to punish us like this? Well, how about we don't sell you rare earths anymore? And suddenly, Mr.
Right.
Trump had a very rude awakening, seeing that you
Right.
need all of that stuff in our defense industry, and we cannot even build weapons without the Chinese,
Correct.
right? So, what
Yes,
are you
exactly.
making out of this, of what we are learning out of the tariff wars, if we want to frame it as that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. What are we learning? Because, what I've learned, and I think what we've seen in the last, 6 months of the Donald Trump presidency is there's been a lot of inconsistency. And
Mm.
so I think that is one thing where, when we're doing business, for example, what do we want? We want to have the ability to forecast into the future. We want stability, especially when you're dealing with multi-billion dollar companies who are, have factories all over the world, who are shipping payments across the world, shipping inventory and having all of this international commerce happening. You want to be able to see what will the future be like. And I think with Trump and this on again, off again tariff is that it's provided a lot of insecurity for the future and a lot of instability. And I think that is really a very difficult environment to do business in. And I think you've started to see a lot of American companies, for example, they've started to pull their guidance, for quarter two, quarter three, and they've said, look, we can't issue guidance right now because we don't know what the actual tariffs are going to be. We don't know how this is going to, influence our business. For example, Ford Motor Company, they have paid around 800 I think it was at $800 million in tariffs so far this last quarter. I just saw a tweet from Mike Pence, the former vice president. Let me just look this up real quick. And so, I mean, he had talked about, yeah, so Ford paid 800 million in tariff costs over 3 months, despite building most of its cars in America. So, you start seeing, that's a tremendous influence to your bottom line, right? I mean, and so again, all of a sudden there's an $800 million cost that Ford has to bear. And unfortunately, again, this goes back to our simple-minded Americans, and I say that with respect to my fellow U.S. citizens. But again, we have the U.S. president saying, right now, billions of dollars of revenue is pouring into the country from around the world. These tariffs are amazing. And his community is thinking, this is incredible. We are making so much money from all around the world. But again, it is Americans and American companies that are paying the tariff fee. Look at Ford. That company is paying the US government $800 million in tariffs. And then who is going to be paying that? Obviously, the Ford consumer. If you're going to go buy a Ford truck, that price will now be increased because of the tariffs. So you're going to be ultimately paying that. But we don't see that in the United States. A lot of people can't process that. And I'm quite amazed by how many people don't realize this basic economic of how tariffs actually work.
But sorry, may I ask one like a question I have? Because okay,
Sure.
this is one side, but isn't the logical implication of Mr. Trump forcing other countries to invest in the United States? Because in his mind, it sounds as if though, these countries then just hand over the cash. But that's not how it
Yeah, yeah.
happens, right? They're gonna buy U.S. stocks, bonds, and ground and companies and factories. So basically, what we are talking about is the Donald Trump forcing foreign investors to own U.S. US things, company stocks,
Yeah,
and so on. And isn't that downstream necessarily going to lead to the situation where the US is going to say, like, hey, why are why is so much of our industry suddenly being owned by the Japanese and the Germans and
right.
Europeans and even the Brazilians, if they ever go along? Isn't this strategically handing over assets to foreigners?
Well, that's a good question, Pascal. I want to say two things because reminded me of something earlier when you talked about tariffs. Tariffs used in specific ways, I think, can actually be good. And like you said in the beginning, you just mentioned, if they're used very strategically and targeting a certain industry. What we've never seen, for example, is we've never seen a president or a country blanket tariff entire countries and like
Yes.
every single industry, right? So that's the difference. Trump's tariffs are very they're very manipulative and they're very they're actually kind of a very, what is the term I'm looking for? It's like a form of, it's a malice attack on a country. They were basically
It's a
a
form of
great example would be
sanction.
April 2nd.
It's kind of
It,
a
it really
sanction.
is. It really is a form of sanction, and it's a very malice attack against the country. Again, you go back to April 2nd, Liberation Day, every single country in the world was tariffed. I mean, you look at like Cambodia. Okay, now you have a 90% tariff, on anything coming from Cambodia. Now, let's give the guests an example. I lived in Canada for 5 years. So, for example, the Canadians, very famous. They have maple syrup. A very big industry in Canada. So Canadians do tariff maple syrup coming from the United States. Okay, that's a very specific industry that they're targeting because in the United States, the state of Vermont produces maple syrup. So if you are in America and you want true maple syrup, you would get that from the state of Vermont, very famous for having maple syrup. In Canada, the whole country, there's maple syrup everywhere. It's a huge industry. And so obviously for Canada, because it's such a vital industry for Canadians, they will tariff that one specific industry from America
Mhm.
because they don't want Americans competing. That would be an example of a functioning tariff that, it's not a, it's there's a specific reason. And I think when you break it down like that, all of us can understand, okay, that makes sense. I understand why the Canadian government would tariff maple syrup. Right? It's not Canada saying we're going to tariff everything from the United States or vice versa. So I think the other thing that's really, conflicting with this, Pascal, is that, we see Donald Trump having these different levels of tariffs and different clauses for your tariffs. For example, when Canada said that they wanted to recognize Palestine, well, Donald Trump immediately went to Truth Social and said, I hear that Canada wants to now recognize Palestine. Well, that is going to influence your tariffs. So that's going to be harder for you to negotiate. Meanwhile, for example, France and Ireland and Norway and Spain have all said that they will recognize Palestine, and Donald Trump has no question. There's no additional tariffs for them.
And for Brazil has a court case going on against the former right-wing president. And Donald Trump dislikes that because he somehow identifies with that, having gone himself through court cases and so on. So he said, "I'm gonna 50% tariff you if this court case continues." As in, oh wow, wow.
Yes, and
It's like you.
and in that and that's a very clear example of interfering into a sovereign nation's domestic affairs, right? I mean, you cannot tariff a country because you don't like the fact that they're having a former president on trial. And the thing is that that former politician is very close Trump ally. So I mean, they were at the White House. There, he's a huge Trump fan. So you can see why Trump would be very much allegiant to that. Trump wants loyalty, and so he will reward anybody that remains loyal to him. But the moment that you are not loyal to him or question him, you're done. So there's a very Donald Trump right now is operating in the United States like an emperor, like a king. And, you have to please the king or you're dismissed from the court. And it's a very difficult situation to see, the world's, most recognizable democracy acting in this manner. And again, I mean, you see the similar thing where, for example, we're going to put an additional 50% tariff on India because they're buying Russian oil. Well, we know that, for example, the United States, up until this day, still buy uranium from Russia, right? We still have to buy uranium from Russia to fuel our own nuclear industry in the United States. New York Times wrote a fascinating article about this. And so again, you have this double standard where India's like, hey, you can criticize us for buying Russian oil. At the end of the day, we need energy, and if there's an opportunity to buy it, we're going to buy it. Where meanwhile, you're also buying energy. You need uranium for your nuclear reactors in the United States, where 25% of your country gets electricity from the nuclear industry. So, have you guys stopped buying uranium from Russia? No.
Yeah, but the beautiful thing about this is that it makes the hypocrisy so obvious that it's just, I mean, you cannot hide that anymore. I mean, it doesn't fit behind any kind of curtain. But it also leaves us with just only one thing, which is the recognition of the fact that the country that for the longest time during the Cold War and into the post-Cold War era was yelling from the top of its lungs, free trade, free trade, free trade, everybody get into the WTO, level playing field, and globalization, has reversed course 180 degrees, or 360, yeah, as the former German foreign minister would say.
Right.
Sorry.
No,
Where does this leave us, though? Because now we have Emperor Trump, and the funny thing is with U.S. foreign policy, like even if the Democrats oppose this, we know that successive presidents then tend not to take back certain of these elements that they in foreign policy that they criticized before. Where does this leave us? Where we now have this largest superpower, and the US still is, I would say, the largest one.
for sure.
Although China is a very, very close right now, is treating world trade like what the Wild West, right? You just whoever shoots first wins.
Right.
What does that do to the rest? Let's say China. What's the approach of the Chinese also together with BRICS in order to somehow deal with this fact that we've got?
Well, I think what you're going to see, Pascal, is you're going to see more countries pivoting towards China and actually, just doing more business deals. So I think, BRICS continues to gain momentum every single month, every single year. It gets bigger. There's more interest from the community. And, I typically do a lot of videos about BRICS because I find it a very fascinating topic. And what I always notice is that whenever I make a video about BRICS, I read through the comments and it's incredible how many people from around the world are thirsty for this. They're hungry for this. They want to see BRICS succeed. And I get comments from Brazil, from African countries, from the Middle East, from Southeast Asia, from all over the world, where people are really wanting this BRICS to succeed and to try to do something different, to really break away from the United States and this stranglehold of power. And so I think what you've seen is very interesting. For example, Modi, from India, he is now going to be scheduling his first state visit with Xi Jinping, in 7 years. And so that's a direct result of these additional tariffs from Trump. And so you see Trump is really driving India closer to China. And this is an interesting one because for many years in the United States, we've always viewed India as a tool that we could basically use to try to contain China or try to we want to have India on our side. And India has always been practicing a diplomacy of trying to work with both camps, right? They want to, certainly have a good relationship with the US, but they're still going to have a relationship with China. They both, Modi and Xi Jinping last year met and said, look, let's put together our border disagreements, the India-China border. We've had some clashes there. It's time to resolve that. Let's move forward from this. And then you see, for example, Brazil. I mean, Brazil is very bullish on doing much more business with China. Interesting enough, I did read an article earlier this week that Brazilian meats will now be starting to import into Japan for the first time in 20 years, as there was an issue with all of these tariffs, and so you see. I saw another article this week where I think there's 153 Brazilian coffee exporters, because they have been tariffed and and basically their market in the United States is drying up. Well, then they've actually all pivoted over to China. So China welcomes in with open arms, and China is the fastest growing coffee nation in the world right now. So there's plenty of market for these Brazilian roasters to bring to produce their beans and send them elsewhere. So I think what you're really seeing here is that especially from China. I was just on the ground for 6 weeks in China, traveling. I traveled to 7 different cities, passing along the way, checking in with different businesses, with clients, and looking, basically trying to get a feel for what China is in 2025. What I really feel, Pascal, is that the Chinese in this manufacturing sector, they're definitely concerned with tariffs. It's definitely been a hit, but it's not like it's going to end their business. For example, the Chinese are very, very savvy. They know that around 16% of their exports go to the United States. Now, 16% is a significant amount, but it's not an amount that's going to bankrupt your business. That being said, the largest trading partner is ASEAN. So it's this association of Southeast Asian nations. And so that is actually China's largest trading group. So you look at, let's increase our trade to Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, these countries that are also really growing. Let's build a better relationship with India. We want to have a much better relationship in South America. Well, Brazil's our economy there. So you're starting to see a lot more trade and a lot more deals flow. And again, I think that with Donald Trump, as he continues down this road, he will only drive more business to China, and China to just say, look, we're just going to continue to diversify by doing more trade with many other countries around the world.
Yeah, that is most likely. On the other hand, I would also say it's unlikely that China will completely give up trying to operate on the US market and vice versa. From my own research of the Second World War, I can tell you that the neutral countries never wanted to give up operating even on the most distant markets. The Swiss always had an interest to be on the Japanese market, not because it was large, it was small. It was like between 1% and 2%. But the companies that were operating in it, they made good profits, and they kept lobbying for maintaining that relationship. So we will. How do you think that companies that are heavily exposed to the U.S. market, Chinese companies that are heavily exposed, what's your take of how they will try to navigate this? Because there are different strategies, and let me just give you one. In the 1980s, the U.S. put a lot of pressure on Japan, right? Because Japan was kind of where China is today, right? And you even had U.S. congressmen like trashing Japanese Sony recorders, right, on Capitol Hill.
Remember that?
And they forced the Japanese to do voluntary trade restrictions, right? Export restrictions, and Japan voluntarily exported less cars. But what they did is instead of exporting a lot of cheap cars, they started exporting only a few, but very expensive, high-end cars on which the profit margins are much higher. So the end result was the Japanese Honda and Toyota, they still made more money than before, but US consumers didn't have access anymore to cheap Japanese cars. So there are ways of dealing with this. What do you foresee how Chinese businesses are going to try to navigate?
Well, there's an interesting thing is that I've spoken to some clients and some business people that I know, and there's a couple things I'm going to mention. Number one is that the Chinese are very savvy. So they've already found many ways to get around this. And so, you've seen, for example, the amount of exports from China to Vietnam has exploded in the last 6 months. Now, let's be very honest here. What's happening? So a lot of exports are being sent to Vietnam and then shipped into the United States. There's also, entire companies that are set up that have basically been able to help you, manage the tariffs. I've had a couple of friends here that are businessmen here in the United States, and they are very worried about this. And so this is always the thing that I find very fascinating, Pascal, is the biggest advocators of tariffs. They're usually blue collar workers that, again, they're not doing business on this international stage. They're just working their 9 to 5. They're just, your average US citizen, going to work at the office, coming home, enjoying a football game, having a beer, just your average American. They're the ones that really resonate with Trump. They're the ones that are kind of believing this story that Trump is telling them. However, when I talk to the businessmen here in the United States that have traveled around the world, that continue to travel around the world and go to Europe and go to Asia and are actually facilitating global trade, they are the ones that are very worried about tariffs. I have a friend of mine that is in the chemical industry. So he deals with a lot of high level chemicals for many different industries. So he said, Cyrus, it's so stressful. I have a container coming over from Shanghai, and I've got my guy on the phone saying, look, we don't know what the tariff will be. As of right now, it's in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It could be 30%, it could be 60%, it could be 20. We have no idea until that, hits the port. And then now he's like, geez, now I've got to, pay this massive tax bill to the US government. And so, but what he's been able to do and what other, actually, there's been actually many other businesses, they've been able to find Chinese companies that, again, are able to, you know, find a way around these tariffs, and that's that there's if there's a will, there's a way. And that's where the Chinese have become very savvy again. So again, you can try to do this, but the Chinese are still going to export it. And again, it's American consumers are the ones that want it. This is the key thing that, everybody is very patriotic and wants to buy American until it comes down to actually, getting your credit card out and making a purchase. That's the thing. Everybody says they want to buy American and don't buy that, but the proof, and this has been proven by many case studies, is that we're only patriotic until it actually comes time to pay. And when you realize why our American companies went to China in the first place, you realize that it's basically. I look at Donald Trump's idea as a very patriotic idea. I give him credit for that. Look, I want to bring American jobs back. I want to have America booming. There's nothing wrong with building more jobs for America and increasing the quality of life in America. Of course, that's what every president should be trying to do for their nation. But it's also very unrealistic to say, we're not going to trade with China anymore. Just bring all the factories back and build them here. It doesn't work like that. It's not how our global economy is set up in 2025.
And one of the fascinating things is that trade is a little bit like water. It always finds a way to flow. And if it gets blocked, it just
Absolutely.
waits until it flows over, right? But see,
100%. 100%.
the problem in the United States is one in which these blue collar workers actually did lose purchasing power, right? They did have a
Yeah.
decline of income, and they did have a decline of available wealth, right? And if you look at the way in which people who manufactured things in the US were able to live in the 1950s and 60s, and how they are able to live in the 2010s and 20s, you see that something went wrong internally.
Right.
Do you think that there's any chance that the United States will try to address this internal wealth discrepancies where you have, like, again, the top 100 are like owning basically 30-40% of the whole US, while the bottom
It's crazy.
50% earn squat?
I think, unfortunately, the way that our capitalist system set up is that it is set up to, it has produced these exceptional billionaires that have a tremendous amount of power. I mean, if you look at what we call the Magnificent Seven stocks, this is your Amazon, Nvidia, Google, Facebook, Tesla, your Microsoft, your biggest seven companies, that makes up around 40% of the stock market. So you think about the entire U.S. stock market is made up of, about 40% is around these seven stocks. And as you look at these CEOs, they're all obviously, have, the net worth is well over $1 trillion. But I mean, every one of them is hundreds of billions of dollars of net worth. And interesting enough, most of them were on stage with President Trump, during the inauguration. You saw Zuckerberg there, you saw Jeff Bezos there, you saw the Google CEO there. So, I mean, all of them were on the stage with Trump. And I think that unfortunately, I think what is very interesting is, especially in the United States, in our political system, is that it is a pay for play system. You have to have a tremendous amount of money to be successful in American politics. So, do I see this being addressed? No, unfortunately, I see the gap only getting bigger, and we just continue to see that. But I mean, here in 2025, I mean, look at what we've seen, for example, in the last 5 years since COVID. Inflation has gone up so much, and there's a lot of misconceptions about that, because the government will release a number saying, okay, inflation's only up, 2%. It's not a big deal, 2% inflation. But the problem is you actually look at the cost of goods, the actual cost of living. If go to your grocery store and buy your 20 essential items. Compare that cost to 2020 to 2025. It's about a 75% increase, and that's not an exaggeration. I mean, across the board, food costs, paper towels, anything of your basic elements in America has gone up substantially in the last 5 years. And so it's really, I would say, post-COVID, or ever since COVID happened, there's been this, it's been a snowball effect where the snowball keeps accelerating, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. I don't see wages are going up. I don't see, the cost of living is very high. I mean, we see real estate market is, still extremely unaffordable in many places. I mean, it is just, unfortunately, America is a place where you have to have money in order to survive. I mean, if you can make good money, then, it's a great place to be. But where it's really feeling the crunch is that lower income, the blue collar families, that lower income class. I mean, they are getting crunched and crunched more and more every day.
Where compared if we compare that to China, like where are they? I mean, they've had the largest economic miracle over the last 30 years, 40 years in human history, right? 800 million people out of poverty into the middle class. From your own, from your life there and also from traveling again recently, is this, if you compare the mood of people in the working class of China and the United States, I would assume that China must be wonderfully optimistic, right, about the future.
Actually, what's really interesting is that I've noticed two things specifically on this trip that I took the last 6 weeks that have changed a lot just in the last couple of years. So, one of the things that was really interesting is that the safety in China has increased to an even more exceptional level. I mean, you're based in Japan, Pascal. I mean, you know that typically throughout Asia, it's generally very, very safe. Obviously, Japan would be a very, very safe country. But we've started to see something that I would say almost actually mirrors Japan, where on the side of the street, people are parking their motorbikes in China and leaving their keys inside, not taking them out. And then, going to, for example, a cafe, a lady putting her handbag down on the counter, or putting a laptop down and then going up to and getting a coffee. This was such a hard thing for me to see because I mean, you would never, ever, would you ever do this in the United States?
And I
You
kid,
couldn't even imagine doing it.
and I kid you not, everybody listening, the same thing happens here. In Tokyo, people leave keys in the ignition, and people leave just they use their wallet to reserve a table while they go to the counter to get a coffee.
It's incredible. And so I started talking to people about this, and they say, China has improved so much where it's like it's even safer now. Like it's getting better. Like the safety, like it was safe before, now it's like ultra safe. It's even more enhanced. And then I was talking to a taxi driver, and I tell you, if you're ever in China and you can speak to the taxi drivers, or if you have a translator, if you're able to speak Chinese, and the taxi drivers are the best, are the most fascinating people to chat with.
Agreed.
So I was talking to him, I was chatting with him, and I said, I'm curious, how much money do you make a month, as a taxi driver? And he said, I make around 6,000 renminbi a month. And this would be around maybe 1,000, just around $1,000 a month. And I said, how is that for you? And he said, 6,000 a month, you can still live a good quality of life here. Am I rich? Of course not. Do I live paycheck to paycheck? Yeah. I mean, I still save a little bit out of that, but like my essentials are covered. And he said, that's the nice thing with China, for example, high-speed internet, right? In the United States, to have high-speed internet in your house, you would be paying the equivalent of, 120, $130 a month to have that inside of your home. In China, I mean, this would be a couple dollars. I mean, it's extremely affordable. You look at your phone, in addition to that, your phone, you're paying around 120 to $150 a month. So just on internet in your home and your cell phone, you're probably around $300 a month in the United States. This would literally be maybe $20 in China. So that, yeah, and because the Chinese government said, having high speed internet in 2025, that's basically like a human right. I mean, like you have to have that to survive in 2025. This is a non-negotiable. And so, I think for China's government, they've done a very good job in making the essential part of your life very affordable. And so when you look at the food costs is extremely affordable, you look at public transportation, you look at internet, you look at these basic things, even a taxi driver making $1,000 a month, that is, that you could actually, you'd be amazed. You're probably saving $200-300 a month out of that salary, paying for his place, and then also, doing his daily life and other needs. And so I think what I would definitely say, Pascal, is that, for the lower class, you're actually much more, it's definitely better to be in China than it would be in the United States. And again, I had this discussion with a taxi driver because he's like, yeah, but I mean, I only earn $1,000 US equivalent. What do you get? What would a taxi driver make in America? I'm sure it's maybe 5 or 6 times that. I said, it would be 5 or 6 times that, but your expenses you couldn't believe. I mean, if you're a taxi driver in New York City, how much do you think your rent would be for that? Plus your gas, which is expensive. I mean, all of these costs. Yeah, you could make 6 times more, but your costs of living might be 20 times more. Or it would be significantly more. So I think there's always a lot of perspective that you need to have, and that's why I think it's so important to travel and see that, because a lot of people in the West that'll be criticized that are like, you know what, the average salary in China is $1,000 US a month. How can anybody live on that? Well, again, you're kind of using China salary and then applying that to life in America. Yeah, of course, that's never going to, compute. But if you actually understand what the cost of life is in China and how people are living, you're going to be able to see that that actually is a good salary and that there is a lot of optimism. I mean, when I'm walking the streets in China, I mean, I went to Beijing and Shanghai, Nanjing, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Hong Kong. There's a different mood in the air. I mean, very interesting. What I've noticed as well, Pascal, is a big rise in local brands, local Chinese brands that are really becoming very popular. I'll give you an example. Uniqlo from Japan, very, very popular. Maybe 10 years ago, I mean, I remember the flagship store opened in Shanghai, thousands of people in there trying to, I mean, everybody it's great quality, right? Uniqlo is amazing, good quality stuff, very affordable price. When I went back this time, yeah, there you go. When I went back this time, I saw a new Chinese store called Benlai, and Benlai is essentially the Chinese Uniqlo. It's exactly the same concept. I mean, it looks almost a mirror image, but it's Chinese. And so I went there, and the prices are even better, and the quality is fantastic. So I'm like, wow, like I'm going to buy some shirts here, and I'm going to buy some, workout clothes, and I'm going to buy a bunch of gear from this store. And that store was packed. And so you see a shift that's happening where, when I first went to China in 2007, people would not want to buy Chinese clothes. People would not want to buy Chinese brands, right? I mean, the Adidas, Nike, obviously Apple cell phones. I mean, anything that was West was considered a luxury, and you wanted to have that. It was much more attractive to be wearing the newest Adidas, trainers as opposed to, the Chinese equivalent. But now you have Chinese brands rising up, and you see this consumer change has changed. And I think a lot of Chinese people, especially the youth, are very patriotic. They're very proud to be Chinese. And I think this is also what what Donald Trump's tariffs have done, is that it has actually inspired the younger generation who are really embracing their roots, embracing their culture, and just saying, I'm very proud to be Chinese. Let's buy Chinese. Let's, build our economy, and let's just do it our way. And if the U.S. wants to play these games, play the games, but we're not going to bow down or be intimidated.
Yeah, I see it. I see it going that way too. I mean, obviously, the success would also breed like pride, justified pride in what you achieve. Last question: how easy is it for foreign companies to do business in China in this new environment? Do you see any danger that some crackdown on the opposite might come from the Chinese government saying like, okay, now we're going to punish U.S. companies in China that operate here because we can't strike back over there? Is there such
Right.
risk? Uh,
I don't think so, because I think let me just say, I would say the answer to that is a firm no, because the thing is that China's economy is not in the strongest position right now. I don't want to portray that, oh wow, the economy is booming over there. I mean, China has its own struggles, its own challenges that it's going through, but I would say that China is very much open up to, foreign direct investment, to working with international companies, and we've seen this as well with the Chinese government opening up many more countries to be visa free into China. And this has been a very significant development. There's 47 countries now visa free, and that has transformed the international tourism market. International tourism to China is skyrocketing, whereas unfortunately in the United States, tourism is actually declining. And we actually see this in the city of Las Vegas, which is actually a very good barometer for the U.S. economy, because if the U.S. economy is good, people have money, and if they have money, they come to Vegas and they play.
Mm.
They come gamble, they go entertain themselves. But Vegas right now is down 11% last month. It's the sixth consecutive month of decline in tourism visits to Las Vegas, and especially the Canadians and Europeans. They're not going. Canadians love Vegas. They're not going because of this. They're specifically boycotting, Donald Trump. And there's been, almost like a little mini recession that has started here in Las Vegas, because of that. And so again, this is this, again, this is kind of one of the first signs of a recession starting, is that, people are not going to Vegas, because the prices are just too high and they don't have the money anymore.
Yeah, you what happens in Vegas stays there, but you don't want to leave anything there at the moment, right?
It's a very different scene. Yeah.
Good. Okay, this is going to be something we will have to monitor, because I do think that these tariffs and everything is going to be a major thing that the US itself is going to stumble over. But it is changing the way that we are doing. We have the way the trade system, the international one, works. China and others are taking the lead in building the future, and we will call upon you again, maybe to tell us what's happening in the business community. Cyrus
Sounds
Janssen,
good,
thank you
Pascal.
very much for your time today.
Pascal, thank you so much. I appreciate you. Thank you.